Memorial's Office of Public Engagement. We're streaming from the Amera Innovation Exchange at Memorial University's Signal Hill campus in St. John's. However, our host and our panelists are in various locations across the province. I just want to note that closed captioning can be turned on and off using the CC button that's down in the bottom left. Before we proceed, we acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups. And we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands where you are located and the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. I'm just going to go over some basic sort of webinar etiquette. Probably most of it will go without saying, but I'll just mention it quickly. We do encourage folks to mute themselves when not speaking. Feel free to turn on your video, leave it off, whatever works for you. We will be having a Q&A session. You can ask questions in the chat ahead of the Q&A, and we will actually be monitoring the chat and we'll come back to them during the Q&A session. Another option is to just raise your hand. So to do that, you can just go to participants on the bottom right hand of your screen, hover over your name on the list, and you'll get an option to raise your hand. And as I said, please feel free to use the chat throughout the session. We'll be popping information in there from time to time, like links, a survey, etc. So do feel free to use that tool as well. We're really looking forward to hearing from our panel about their experiences building healthy community-university relationships and partnerships. As interest in public engagement grows, it's important that researchers and community partners are able to communicate about opportunities, goals, and ideas in ways that are equitable, respectful, and based in relationship. So to get things beginning, I'd like to introduce our host. She's the CEO of SmartIce, Carol Ann Harding. SmartIce is an internationally recognized community-based work-integrated social enterprise. It offers climate change adaptation tools and services that integrate Inuit knowledge with monitoring technology. So with that, welcome, Carol Ann.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you very much and welcome everybody. Thanks for deciding to spend the next hour and a half with us. I hope this conversation will be from the heart, lots of experiences of what maybe has worked and has not worked as we go through some of the questions. So thanks to the Hair Center for asking me to moderate. And so we want to make sure that all of our efforts collectively and wherever we are at the university or in the community, how we work with communities that, is respectful and how do we engage? And who defines success? And I'm going to leave that with you as a question, and we'll probably touch on that today. And I'll touch on that and give you an example of what we do with SmartIce. It's a work in progress every single day because there's no magic bullet for exactly what you do with exactly what community. Because who can better define success other than the communities? So being open to new ideas, conversations, and being an incredibly good listener is very, very important. So with SmartIce, one of the things that we do, just to help frame up the conversation today, is that we have community management committees in each of the communities that we work in. And some of the committees are very established and some we're just beginning, but it's an interesting process to go through and it is not easy. But the community management committees really defines how we work in each community, and they really incorporate a wide variety of people, stakeholders from the community, whether it be youth, hunters and trappers, elders, other types of knowledge keepers, etc. And then we learn and we listen. So every day we walk in very humbly with an open mind, listen very well, and work on things together. And so that definition of success really comes from the communities that we work with, and we are there to serve them. So it does work for us. We work hard every day to learn more and more about that. We're proud of the work that we've done so far. So let's introduce our panelists for today. So you've got like 1 minute or so because we want to dive into the conversation, which is always where the magic happens. So we'll start with Kellyanne Butler.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Butler, and I'm the Indigenous Education Specialist here at Memorial University for any campus, but I'm based at the St. John's campus. And I do a lot of work with engagement, primarily with Indigenous communities. I am a member of the Mi'kmaq community. My origins are in Seal Rocks, which is near St. George's or part of St. George's on the west coast of the island. And I'm very happy to be here today. Thanks.
Thanks, Kellyanne. Dr. Heather Carnahan, welcome.
Hi, I'm at the Marine Institute. I'm a professor and the Lockheed Martin Chair in Marine Simulation and Learning. And I run the Ocean Safety Lab here, as well as the academic director of the MSc and PhD programs.
Great, thanks so much. Boyan first.
Hello, everybody. My name is Boyan First. I am Manager of Knowledge Mobilization with the Harris Center here at Memorial University.
Great, thanks. You guys are really sticking to your 1 minute, less than 1 minute. Garrett Richards.
Hi, I'm an assistant professor with the Environmental Policy Institute at Grenfell campus. I'll say a tiny bit more about some of my engagement activities if I have a minute. I have a research initiative called the Environmental Policy Innovation Lab, and a lot of what we do is short-term partnered research projects, pairing one student with one partner to do research on an environmental policy related topic that the partner is interested in. I also teach 2 courses that engage government. So one at the master's level, one at the PhD level. The PhD one also engages one partner from industry, from Indigenous communities, and from NGO. So it covers a range of stakeholders. And I'm also the graduate officer for our new PhD program, which emphasizes engaged research with one of those stakeholders. So all the students in the program do engage research for their thesis.
Great, thanks, Garrett. Lots on the go there for sure. And Josh Smee.
Hey folks, I'm Josh. I'm the CEO of Food First NL. So we're a nonprofit organization that works to advance food security in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I've been on pretty much every side of this conversation over the years. I've done community engaged research work as a student, very briefly as a sessional instructor, as a CEO at a community organization, as staff at others. So I'm quite excited to kick this around. I think it's an important topic, and thanks for having me.
Thanks, Josh. And Josh and I are no stranger. I am the chair of Food First Board, and Josh is the CEO for Food First. So glad to see you here in a different capacity. We're working together.
Totally.
All right, so I'm going to throw this out to everybody. I'm not sure how you're going to see this on the screen, but I think it might be useful if the panelists are all together. I don't know if you can, there we go, because maybe you can bounce ideas off each other, but we'll start with Josh. And I'm going to ask, how do, assuming that you're working with a university learning institute, something like that, and community relationships relate to your work, and then we'll pass it on then to Kelly, and then Garrett, and then Heather, and then Boyan. So how do university community relationships relate to your work?
Sure. So here at Food First, I think the best way to think about it is that there are 3 sort of main points of connection that we typically have, and all of them are active right now. So one of them is we are often partnering directly with researchers to advance on the ground work in food security somewhere. So for example, right now we have quite a large project just getting off the ground around working with the retail sector to improve food access for low-income folks. And a very significant proportion of that project's resources and budget are flowing through a research team. We've integrated our project with a MUN research team to give both teams a chance to actually leverage their project into something bigger. So that's one area we often do. We often are looking for places where we're actively partnering on research that's of shared interest, and that's the biggest one for us now. The other sort of axis of collaboration that's really common for us is around advocacy work. So we often find ourselves reaching out to partners in the academic space to build out data around advocacy priorities that we're taking. I'll talk a little bit about that probably later in this, but for example, we do quite a bit of work with Proof, which is an institute at the University of Toronto, which focuses on food insecurity. So, just a couple of weeks ago, we just finished up a minimum wage review submission with them. jointly submitted. And so we quite often reach out to the research community around those kind of more contained advocacy agenda points. And then the third one is that university programs are one of the most important parts of our hiring pipeline here at Food First. So we pretty much always have some representation from a university program on staff. So right now we're just finishing up a Master's of Applied Psychological Sciences placement. That's probably the most common, but we've had many different student placements over the years, and a good number of our staff are folks who came in as students and never left. And so that is a really, I think we should name that as one of the more important points of connection between community and academia here. So yeah, 3 buckets: partnerships, advocacy, employment. That's probably the simplest way to put it.
Yeah, great points. And certainly 3 with Smart Ice, it's the employment piece of it, and the work integrated learning opportunities is amazing. All right, Kelly.
Thank you. Yeah, my role has a lot of different layers to it as well in terms of engagement with community. And so in my role, I'm working with making institutional change, but also sometimes doing one-on-one work with faculty, staff, or students in terms of, and not necessarily one-on-one, but a small workshop and that kind of thing. And trying to integrate Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing into an institution, like all institutions that has not had that for hundreds of years, right? So in order to get that into the institution and sort of try to weave that into the fabric of the university community, it requires all kinds of engagement with Indigenous communities. And so sometimes I'm directly engaged myself with Indigenous communities. And so currently I'm working on creating a set of online modules, learning modules for people in the university. And that necessitates getting, the actual stories from Indigenous peoples, because the history of Indigenous peoples in the world, actually, not just here, is that it's generally been studied and taught by people who are not Indigenous and not from those communities. So that is a necessity for sure. But also in working with individual professors who are attempting to sort of update their courses or trying to look at ways that they can integrate more either Indigenous voices, Indigenous lens, and especially like this Indigenous ways, Indigenous pedagogies, ways of knowing, being, and doing. A lot of people require some assistance because this is not something that any of us had in our education up to this point. You could go to school for 20 years and you may never have had anything substantial, and especially not taught by Indigenous peoples about themselves. And so my work just overlaps all of this all the time, whether it's me helping someone else to connect with community members or my own engagement with them in terms of trying to put together what communities want to see in the university in terms of education.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So that concept of co-design of work and being engaged is incredibly, incredibly important. We're doing co-design curriculum right now that every day we're blown out of the water with learning, with, me learning and all of us learning about Indigenous ways of knowing and learning. Very different and very, it's so humbling and respectful, entering into that learning from the communities and from the people. So it's really, it's incredibly heartwarming for me because, every day is a good day when you learn something. Garrett, thanks, Kelly.
Thanks. Just a warning, if you hear some weird background noise here, there is a ton of snow in Corner Brook today, and the plows have just been going by my house all day. I was woken up by a plow and I thought, oh, there was no snow last night. What's going on? So anyways, that's what it is. So I said a little bit about some of my activities in my introduction, but there's a little bit more I can say. So first of all, for the Environmental Policy Innovation Labs, that's basically my main research initiative. The main thing that we do is those short-term partner projects with external partners from NGOs, government, community groups, Indigenous organizations, any range of potential partners. But there are other things that happen in that space as well, or at least intend to happen in that space. So there's discussions with students about community engagement. So there's a little bit of training going on there. It's also meant to be a space to host conversations with external partners, potentially do things like multi-stakeholder dialogues, but it's pretty new. I'm still pretty new to this position. So a lot of that is still being developed. I also wanted to elaborate a little bit on some of the engaged courses that I'm involved with. So the master's level course that we have for our environmental policy program, the collaboration there is with the provincial government and with the city of Corner Brook. So when I teach it, I actually didn't teach it this year, but when I teach it, we do 2 projects, one with the city and one with the province. And we basically get students doing work on, I don't love this term, but I can't think of something better, real world policy issues for those levels of government. So getting them to generate for us some of their current research priorities or sort of needs around policy thinking, and then getting students to work in that space. So that's a really nice mutual arrangement in my view. And one thing I forgot to mention and should have mentioned is I'm also the internship officer for the master's level program. So, I didn't necessarily go into that position thinking of it as an engagement position, but it really is. There's so much discussion to be had with the potential hosts for student internships. And there's a lot of work that can go into supporting applications for funding and figuring out arrangements for students, and then synergies, like really interesting synergies between that role and other things. So for example, being able to say to a potential host, okay, it looks like things aren't going to work out this year for an internship, but would you like to do a project through EPI Lab, or would you like to partner on one of these courses? So, I'm seeing a bit of a theme in terms of synergy. And earlier when you were talking about co-design, I'm also seeing this theme in terms of layers. So I am doing that work, but thinking back, there's been some missed opportunities for me in terms of doing more co-design for some of that work. There were some attempts a little bit at consultation for some of those things when I was putting them together, but I think I could have done more. And if I was to design something new at this point, I think I would approach it differently. So there are a lot of different layers to engagement, whether it's in research or teaching or service.
Yeah, absolutely. That's excellent. We're going to have quite a different variety, I think, of answers here for this one. How about Warren?
So here at the Harris Center, that's pretty much the description of our job, to connect university and the communities. We do that through the entire range of our programming, and sometimes in ways that people don't necessarily see. So on the regional development side, we have Thriving Regions Partnership Program, which is really a series of workshops that helps community figure out some priorities. We introduce them to some researchers. They help shape research projects. They sit on the evaluation committee that picks the final research projects, and then they work with researchers. And we continue working with the region and the community for about a year and a half in a variety of ways. Through our public policy programming, we provide platform to various members of the community to speak on just about every issue under the sun. I think literally everybody on this panel at some point has been on a Harris Center panel for one thing or another. We also try to embed that community input in things that you don't necessarily see. So planning committees, steering committees, evaluation committees. We have completely changed the evaluation of all of our funds. They now have a community co-chair and an academic co-chair, equal number of community and academic evaluators. It makes for much better and much richer conversations, and quite frankly, for much better projects. And that goes right across our funding. We have just launched 2 funds for Arctic research. One is specifically a fund. It's not for research, it's for relationships building. And it's wide open. So if you are a new researcher who doesn't have a relationship with an Arctic Indigenous community or a community or an organization, but you are interested in doing some work, here is a little bit of support to help you build those relationships. There is no expectation that you are going to come back with a research project or anything like that, but you have to start somewhere. So here is an opportunity to start. The other fund is for experienced researchers who already have established relationships, meet all of the ethics guidelines and the research in Indigenous communities guidelines, and can just hit the ground running. So there is a little bit larger fund for them to help them work on the research projects. So really, it's right across our programming that we try to embed that community university relationship to make sure that what we do is relevant to the province.
Yeah, absolutely. So you work as a broker, really. that
Exactly. Yeah.
navigate-
It's funny, you know, it's one thing that I forget all the time, that's my other part of my job. Because when you broker a good project, everybody, including you sometimes, is supposed to forget about you. People are supposed to feel they've known each other forever. They've been at this forever, because you can't insert yourself into that relationship over and over again. Once they go and do their thing, you have to step back, and you know, sometimes they remember and say, hey, yeah, Harris Center introduced us and bought the cookies for that first meeting. But sometimes they forget, and that's fine. That's part of the job.
Yeah, people gel over food. It's a good thing.
Oh yes, absolutely. We always make sure there is food when we have an
That's
event.
right. Heather, over to you.
Oh, hi there. Well, I come from the Marine Institute, and I'm here today really from the perspective of my work, which is research and graduate education. So, the mission of the Marine Institute is to foster economic development. So it's sort of like in our DNA, so to speak. All of our work, the education programs, as well as the research, has a community link to it. So for example, you know, some of my research involves fish harvesters. Well, I have a faculty member who works at the Marine Institute who also is a fish harvester. He works on the ocean for 6 months of the year and works at the Marine Institute for 6 months of the year, and also consults on and is an active participant in our research as well. So those types of ties happen very naturally. You know, I'm really fortunate to be in that environment because they happen so naturally. And we developed, we're really proud of a new grad program that was launched about 18 months ago. But we have as a requirement in this graduate program that a community member sits on the advisory committee. So we have people from various industries, from Coast Guard, Transport Canada, from the fishing industry, whatever specific to the student's project, you know, search and rescue. These people who work in these fields sit on the committees to make sure that we keep our research real, you know, that we're asking questions that are relevant, not only to us as scientists, but also that our results will have direct impact on the community. So.
Yeah, interesting. So keep the research real. That's what we want to do, right? We want to make sure it's real, relevant, and respectful. All right, I'm going to ask you all a question. We'll try to do maybe a bit of a hot potato. What are some of the nuts and bolts that you would think people should know before beginning this type of work? So I'm just going to throw the floor open, and maybe these are takeaways that some of our audience might be able to say, oh, I haven't tried that, or I don't know that I didn't know that. So we'll start with Josh. I'll put Josh on the hot seat, and then we'll fire off a few questions, rapid round.
I've got a couple like really applied practical ones that I think are interesting to think about or for people to be aware of. One of them is timelines. So I think one of the biggest points of friction on community university partnership is around timelines. I think the best way of describing what it looks like from my side is hurry up and wait. That what ended up happening is that the approval cycle for academic projects is too long, and then the project cycle is too short. So I'm often in a position of kind of waiting for things to walk themselves through the umpteen layers of approval within academia, and then they get approved, and then the timeline to actually do the thing is too fast for me. So you end up actually kind of challenged on both sides. So I think one of the things when you're moving into building a project together or doing something concrete is really seriously think about how you're going to address that. The academic folks know what their timelines look like. And it's important for both sides to have a really kind of clear conversation about that and just lay it out and be honest. Because we also, I think, all of us in our work lives have an incentive to BS about timelines in a way that can be a real challenge when it comes down to then sitting down together and laying out something that's really going to work. So that's I think the biggest one. The other one I wanted to flag, just thinking about this, is that the ethics review process does not think about community partnerships very well. So I have been in the position as a nonprofit without a formal academic affiliation, it is extraordinarily difficult to figure out where to go when you need ethics approval on a project. So in our world, for example, sometimes when we work with the feds, they require it. But I cannot, as a nonprofit organization without an academic partner, just go to the ethics board at MUN and ask them to review a project. They'll turn me away. And the health ethics board will usually say you should go to the MUN one. And so we often end up kind of getting ping-ponged around until we lasso an academic into the relationship in some way, and then we can get in the door. But it's a real, I think, just as a concrete challenge, navigating ethics, both if you are partnered with an academic and working through ethics that way, that's new territory for many community organizations. Or if the community organization has to take the lead on ethics, that's new territory for ethics offices. So both ways, I think, just again, when beginning a partnership, it's really important to think about those two things. That was not very rapid fire. Sorry, Caroline.
No, but very, very important. All right, jump in. Who's next? Kelly.
Thanks. This one may sound kind of simple, but it's really, really important. Before you start doing anything, I think you have to sit down and have a self-reflection exercise and ask yourself if you understand the difference between a transaction and a relationship. Because I think, and again, I'm speaking from my context working with Indigenous communities and being in Indigenous communities. This is the history of colonialism, is the promise of relationships and ending up with transactions that end up harming the community. So I think that that's the first thing, because there are some people who absolutely should not be engaging in relationships with communities. I mean, that's just reality. And I think sometimes the way the funding agencies send out calls, it implies that everyone should be applying for this, and not everybody should be applying for everything, right? So that's the first thing, is to have a conversation with yourself or with whoever it is that you might be working with within your institution, and to say, like, is this something we actually want to do? A relationship is something that goes on and on and on and is reciprocal. And a transaction is sign on the dotted line and I'm never talking to you again. And unfortunately that happens a lot. So that I have a bunch of other things I could suggest, but like that to me is the most important thing at the very beginning is, should you even be entertaining this idea? And then go from there.
Yeah, and it's okay if the answer is no, right? So it's great if the answer is yes, but if the answer is no, that's just as valuable in my mind. Would you agree with that? Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Thanks, Kelly. Perfect. Who's going to jump on now? Okay, Bjorn.
So maybe if I can just add to what Kellyanne just said. Also ask yourself, what is your expertise? Not what is the project you want to do, because you need, before you think about projects, you need to talk to people, but offer your expertise, because that's what you have. And then project will emerge down the road, and it's probably not going to be what you vaguely think it is, but that's okay. Just focus on what is that you bring that's valuable, that you can, when you leave, those you're working with should be in some way better off than before you were there. And it doesn't have to be, oh, I changed the world. Just people have learned something they didn't know about. They have an ability to engage with researchers in the future in ways that they couldn't before. Maybe there is a project at the end and you are able to leave something behind that becomes a community resource. It doesn't really matter as long as you are both okay with what that is, but focus on your expertise, focus on what you're bringing to this relationship at the beginning, and then projects will come. Don't come in with, I want to do this project, because, I mean, yeah, maybe that is the project, but likely it's not.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
I'll jump in.
Heather.
I mean, really, everyone else has been talking about this in different ways, but it's about communication, like in any relationship. And I kind of refer to it as a sort of scientific dating. You know, you don't just jump in. First, you start with the coffee dates. You know, first you talk on the phone, then you have the coffee date, and you work up to the dinner date. And then maybe finally you're ready to actually launch a project together. But sometimes these relationships take years before you actually, I'm just initiating some work now, and it's taken years because I had to learn the language of the people who I'm speaking with, and they had to understand my academic perspective, and that takes time. And I think there's a mystery with academia that sometimes community members may be intimidated by that, and you need to kind of break all that down.
Excellent. Thanks, Heather. Garrett.
I'll add two things. The first is, and other people have touched on this, but I find we have a bit of a construct that we use for the PhD program when we talk about engagement, and even this is new as well. This is all sort of in draft form. But thinking about the different, I'll say stages, but it's not linear necessarily, but sort of the different stages of a relationship. And so if you're just getting started, just acknowledging that there are the different pieces that need to take place usually in typical fashion. So it starts with that sort of initial contact and establishing the relationship. And yeah, a lot of that is not going to, ideally, it's not going to be as much about like, oh, here's the very specific project that we need to do, and we need to do that. It should be more of a general conversation. And then there's sort of building and maintaining the partnership, moving towards sort of co-producing within the partnership, and then fulfilling and mobilizing the partnership. These are the stages that we're using in draft form anyways. And you can also think of that as cyclical. But yeah, that point about not coming in, not jumping the gun and sort of saying, well, here's what we need to do. This is what the relationship is going to look like when it's producing. We're going to start producing right away, whatever the output is. But starting with the conversation and knowing that needs to happen, or at least being transparent about your limitations, right? If you're a grad student, you legitimately need to finish something on a certain timeline. You can say, yep, I need to do this, and these are the conditions of the funding. So, that can come out pretty early in the conversation. But if you have the flexibility that, many researchers will have, it's much better to start with a more general conversation. But yes, it's about things like interests, potentially shared interests and shared strengths, or where you can complement each other's strengths rather than here's a specific project. And a little bit related to that, this is another point I've been mulling around recently, is the idea that when we can, and this is so hard to do in academia, and even this is true for me as well, almost all of my engagement with partners, it's always in the context of something. It's always, I'm doing this class and I'd like to engage with you, or there's this funding proposal and I'd like to talk about engagement. I can never seem to make the time to just meet with a partner and just establish what our mutual interests might be, and just leave it. And then maybe later, some opportunity comes up. I find it's really difficult to make that space, but I think if we could do that, sort of make that slack space where we can just engage and not always be, well, we're talking about this funding deadline, so there's this time pressure. That would be great. I don't know how to do that yet, but I'm trying to recognize that there's a need to create that space.
Yeah, I like that idea. So it's calling somebody to just say, hey, how are you? Instead of asking them for something, right? Just, yeah, that space, to hold that safe space for that conversation to be able to flow. Very interesting. I know when I first started working in Indigenous communities, I remember going to the community first, and they were looking at me going, who's she? Didn't matter where I went. It was like, who's this stranger in town? And talked to people, but they were very kind of reluctant. The next time I went back, there was a few that went like, oh, she's back. And then it took to the third time, a year and a half later, for people to go, all right, now we're going to seriously talk to you. And so it took that amount of time, many phone calls and 3 trips to the community. So I often say that it's really critical. So this is my quick hit, is boots on the ground. You need to go, you need to learn, you need to see where people are living, what they're experiencing, whether it be with, in our case, climate change adaptation, and how communities communicate. We are doing a project right now in Pond Inlet, and how we are working with this is the local bingo game, and it's going crazy. People are like jumping on for the feedback because they're getting bingo cards. It's very community specific. But we wouldn't have known if we were not on the ground, right? Boots on the ground. So that would be my takeaway to add to that list. Thanks, everybody. That was really great. So, Axeli, I don't know if you were able to capture some of that, but some of those succinct points, if you want to put in the chat, that would be great, and people can kind of pull those out into their own notes if you have the opportunity to do that. Okay, I would like to know can you give me an example of a real, particularly a real successful, a success that you've had within community, and potentially something that did not work? Because we learn more from things that did not work, and then we've changed it to make it successful. So where it might be a little vulnerable answering those questions, but I think people would really like to know. So what worked and maybe what did not work? Choose what you want to start with first. And we're going to start with Kelly.
Thanks. So I can give you an example of what ended up and still is a really successful relationship. And in my situation, I'm a member of the community and I'm a member of the university community. So it might be slightly different than what some people engaging would experience. But we did a partnership between, this was when I was at Grenfell campus before coming over here to St. John's campus, but a partnership between my office, the Office of Research and Grad Studies at the campus, and the Bay St. George Mi'kmaq Cultural Revival Committee in the Bay St. George area, St. George's Flat Bay area. We set up a symposium where it would be 2 days. The first day would be in the community, like in the parish hall in St. George's, and the second day would be on campus. And we sort of billed it as an Indigenous research symposium, and it was a little bit of a bait and switch because on purpose, some of the people I think came thinking this was going to be some sort of networking opportunity. But actually what we did was not talk about research at all. And the only thing we were talking about was relationships. And so, you know, there was a commitment made that people from the campus drove out to St. George's to participate in this parish hall with community members. And then the next day, community members made that commitment to drive, you know, an hour and 10 minutes or whatever to the campus and participate. And talking about relationships, we had a styrofoam board up where people use Post-it notes to just write down qualities of relationships, any kind of relationship, you know, and stick them up. You don't put your name on it or anything. And this was the discussion, was just about that, like and of course there were people who gave presentations and whatnot, but all of it was about relationships. It wasn't about research at all. And the whole point of that was to, I think, demonstrate to people from the campus that this is how it is. It's, you don't say, I have this idea and I'm going to do it. And now, you know, going back to the parallel to an actual relationship or a dating situation, if you went on a date and somebody asked you, how many kids do you want to have? And, you know, where do you know, like, you'd be like, we're not supposed to talk about that. I don't even know you, you know, that's what happens sometimes with very enthusiastic researchers, you know, who have this idea they think is wonderful and showing up with all of it all laid out. I mean, nobody would want that if someone came to you with that and said, here's what I want, and I want you to, I'm going to insert you into that. So we did this whole symposium just talking about relationships and then giving examples, and some of the people from community were able to give positive experiences that they had in the past with researchers, and some gave some negative, and everyone just sort of openly talked. It was to me, it was the best experience I've ever had in terms of an institutional event. But it was because it was in partnership, and the partnership was a real partnership. It wasn't one where someone's on board, but it's actually being organized by just the university. It was actually a partnership. And we came out of that with goals, and we've continued that. We ended up actually getting funding through the Office of Public Engagement for this like second phase of that, and we're still doing that now. I think 1 or 2 of the people involved is watching right now, but that was a really good example of trying to educate through the practice of how we organized it, but also just the conversations that came out, and then it grew from there. In terms of something that didn't go well, again, I'm in a different situation because I'm a member of the community, and so the kinds of things I would suggest or attempt are coming from being based in the community. But I have had experiences where I've had very well-meaning people inside the university come to me and want me to make connections. And I've had really, really terrible, some very terrible experiences with that. And it's not because anybody was, in my situations, it's not because anyone had, you know, like a nefarious plot on their minds. It was a difference in worldviews, a difference in expectations, and my being, I think, naive, because this was when I was newer at the university, thinking that everything spoke for itself. And if this person said, I'm so excited, I want to do this project, I connect them with someone, and then I find out. And sadly, sometimes I didn't find out until months later because the person in the community was afraid to tell me how badly it went. And I learned from that. And now I have, sometimes I think people don't understand what they think is like a gatekeeper situation. It's not gatekeeping, it's protection. And I learned from those situations. And sadly, I don't think that the people who were involved learned. But it is something that I think is starting to change, just with more dialogue and more good work happening. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. Garrett.
I want to start with the example of things going poorly. So both of these examples are going to come from our new PhD program. So it's very new. The program itself is new. It's the first PhD program at Grenfell. The courses are new. Everything's new and experimental. So, in a way, it's not surprising that some things would, end up with a little bit of friction, I suppose. Anyways, there's some good examples, but the program is transdisciplinary sustainability. So the idea is that we're training and preparing our students to do work on sustainability research questions that can cross disciplines and engages external partners. So those are sort of the different criteria. So one of the courses that we teach is basically a transdisciplinary methods course. So that's a course where we engage with a variety of different partners. And we try to get a good breadth of partners, and we try to engage each year, have at least one partner or contact from industry, one from government, one from NGO, and one from Indigenous organizations or communities. So in the first year, our attempt at this, what we decided we wanted students to do for the partnered piece was, we were thinking about what might be doable in the time frame of a class. And what we decided to do, and this was the mistake, was what we wanted them to do with the partners was develop a proposal for a research project, because we didn't think that they could finish the research project in the timeline of the course. So we spent the first half of the course, talking about interdisciplinarity and doing internal things, and then we engaged with the partners, and we thought, we only have time to do the proposals. And we also used the word hypothetical around the proposals, because we didn't want to commit the students to anything. But this didn't really work out for some of the partners, right? Because they're engaging with the students. We've asked them to talk to the students about their research priorities and talk about a potential research project. But, what was underlying all of that is, we're not necessarily going to do anything about this. This is just a learning exercise. It doesn't really give the partner anything unless they happen to be able to match that proposal up with something later. So, some of the partners, they were, I think some partners, I think sometimes it's, the way I want to say this is sometimes people are too nice and they won't tell us what's wrong with the design. But we did have, a set of partners that said, this didn't work for us. This is not what we want. We're unhappy with the outcome. So I really appreciated that opportunity. And we ended up, I think, coming up with a way of potentially trying to address that, where sort of after the course, through EPI Lab, we attempted to pair that same partner with some student resources that could do a project with them. So I could go into more detail, but essentially there was a real learning process for the instructors and everybody involved. And I found it really, really fascinating. And I was really grateful that the partners would communicate that to us, to say, this didn't work out. And we love when partners are nice as well, of course, but there's a really interesting theme I'm noticing with a lot of the work that I do, where it's sometimes difficult for me to get from the partners what they really need from us. Like, I think everyone's just so nice, and it's great that we're all being nice to each other, but it's like, I want to pull out from them, tell us what more you need, or tell if what the students have proposed isn't what you need, tell us that. And it's hard. I think that's just a hard situation for anyone to be in. But anyways, in that case, they did tell us. So in a way, it was a success. And the success side of this is that the next year, we changed the way that we did the course. And we said, let's engage the partners basically from the beginning. Let's give the students an opportunity to do a proposal and a full project within the context of the course. And that's still a challenge, but we're not undergoing this sort of hypothetical proposal mode of things. So, that's the success part of it, is that we changed things. Now that course is just finishing up now, so it's too early to say whether all of those projects have ended up with good outcomes. But I felt good about the change in the way that we ran the courses.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that. Josh.
I think I'm using for one of our projects, some of your students to do a project for us, in fact. And
Yes.
So far so good. So that was a successful revision. Thank you. Couple of things. I think on the things that don't work category, maybe I'll be categorical here. I don't want to name specific examples, but there's a couple types of things I've seen from my lens in the community sector that's not uncommon. One of them is sort of conflict over what happens with the results of this work after, right? So say that us as a community partner, we've worked with an academic to do some piece of work together, then it's done. And then we have this work, maybe some of it lives on our website or whoever the community partner's website. Some of it becomes academic work for that person. That person is now using that in their sort of career trajectory. We're using it in our organizational trajectory. What happens when the way that you talk about that work diverges? And I've seen that happen lots of times, right? Where different people are using the same work to say different things or taking different lenses. And what happens when lenses start to conflict, right? Like if you have someone who you've worked with before, but sometimes like the way that they talk about the work after clashes with the way that you would frame it now. Like, I think it's just something that we don't always think about going into these partnerships, is like what happens 5 years after the partnership is done. And this is a body of work that is out in the world somewhere. And I've seen that happen in my time in the nonprofit sector pretty often. The other one I'd flag on this in general, for organizations that work with vulnerable populations, there's a specifically problematic interaction that happens, right? Because you do get researchers knocking at the door thinking they're doing you the biggest favor because you work with these, poor folks who are suffering from XYZ thing, and they're bringing attention and light into this work. I think academics should not be surprised, but some are, at how much time community organizations sometimes have to spend vetting and fending off research requests. And that can be just a relationship challenge too. Like, how do we build kind of ongoing partnerships when we've had to tell somebody to go away on something before? And so again, I think like that, I don't have a specific here, but that's a categorical that you do see. And I think particularly for folks who have folks that they're working with who face these vulnerabilities. On the positive side, there's a couple I can think of from recent time in my own personal experience I might flag. One I mentioned kind of at the top of this call. We just had a really good experience doing a policy submission with an academic partner. We called them, we said there's this submission on, in this case it was on minimum wage. We emailed them, we said this thing's due in a couple of weeks. You probably have a better sense of the data, the more definitive sense of the data, and ability in particular. What we really lean our academic partners to do is tell us our limits, right? When you're doing advocacy work, the real challenge is not getting your kind of rhetoric ahead of what the data says, but working with these research partners, they were really good at saying, we can't go quite that far in this submission because we don't know that for sure, or this is what the data really undergirds. And they put time into it. They had an RA who was working in their lab who basically drafted the guts of it and then let us make it fit. And so I think having these kind of time-defined projects with a specific objective where you know that there's a mutual understanding of the context really matters. And so I think that's the other thing when we talk about kind of community university partnerships. Sometimes we're thinking in too expansive of a way, right? Sometimes it really is. You're just identifying an academic partner or partners who are knowledgeable on a file. It's something that you're going to get done and dusted in 2 weeks, and it boosts everybody in the process, but it's not longer than that. So maybe I just want to flag that, as I think there's a lot of successes in that space. Hello. There's a lot of successes in that space that we sometimes miss because some of the infrastructure around these conversations is set up to talk about the kind of more expansive long-term capital P partnerships.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, thanks for that. Heather.
First, just before I go on with my example, I just wanted to respond sort of to what I've been hearing. First of all, thank you. I'm really learning a lot, especially from the community partners perspective, which is, not the lens that I look at the world. So that's been really helpful. And just to add, in the work I do, I'm dealing generally with industrial partners. So everything about our relationship is written in a contract because there's money involved, before we do anything. And it is a bit cumbersome at the front end, but I must say it helps. It's helped me sidestep a lot of the issues that I'm hearing. Because there's no ambiguity about any of the end results of what we do and whatnot. I'm not sure if that works in the context so that you other folks are working in. The example I'm going to give of a project gone well and gone poorly is the same project, but just different aspects of it. We have initiated something called a micro research, and that's an initiative initially developed by a woman named Noni McDonald from Dalhousie University. She's a pediatrician with the World Health Organization. And what it is, it's bringing research to the community by kind of enabling the community to ask their own questions and do their own research. And she's launched this program through a lot through Africa, and primarily related to health-related questions. She's also been doing it in Nova Scotia. And so Rose Ricardelli, actually she's a new research chair at the Marine Institute, was formerly in sociology at MUN. She brought it to the Marine Institute. And so Rose and I together developed the micro research program, and we offered it up here. And when I say it was hugely successful, within a 2-week period, we had a group of naive to research people at the end having proposed a research question, developed a methodology, and they were coached kind of through, that's what Rose and I did through the week. There were lectures given and lots of workshop-y type stuff. So by the end, they have a project that the group themselves are going to run, and it will be a publishable piece of research, if they bring it to completion, which there's a commitment to do, because there's also associated with this program, we've provided a few $1,000s of support money. And so the community members themselves have developed this question, and they now have the basic research skills with mentorship to run their own research studies. In this particular case, they actually chose a question about mental health and fish harvesters. And they're doing some interviews, sort of a qualitative research approach, assessing what the status of mental health and people's access to mental health resources is for fish harvesting population. And so that was the success. These people were rock stars. They learned so much, and they're, really are going to do a great project. But the failure is just that the structure of this program, it was unrealistic for many people to participate in because it required essentially 2 weeks of commitment. We did it online so that people could join in from, wherever they were. But the initial outline of the program was that it actually be an in-person full 2-week session. So that requires your employers to have a complete buy-in and support of this, to give you that time off work. Now it's been successful with parole officers, other various community groups. But we really have to rethink this program if we want it to be successful, to kind of work with the people we're really trying to reach. But it was a neat concept, and we wanted to try it. And it was, when I say moderately successful, is because we had a very skewed group of people who participated, who had the privilege of having that kind of flexibility in their schedules. But the people we're really trying to target, maybe not. And so we need to kind of revamp it. I think we'll strip it down and maybe do one evening a week and spread it over 12 weeks, something like that. A commitment that might be more realistic for other groups. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Boyne, your last.
Sure, I'll try to be quick. So the example of something that didn't work, and I'm not going to name names or communities here. It was a thriving regions partnership process, and it was very early on when we introduced this. We were still very much experimenting, and we went into a region, and there was a bunch of yellow flags right from the beginning. But at that point, we felt we couldn't just leave, and we should have, in retrospect. But we didn't. And part of the problem is that in the program, we didn't build the sort of an off-ramp that allowed us to work with community in a different way if this program doesn't work. We pushed through, we had to put a lot of extra work. One of the projects did not work out at all. Luckily for us and for the community partners, two were excellent, and they actually brought quite a bit to the community, which is great. But it was, as a process, it was not successful at all. We just lucked out with those two particular researchers and those two particular community partners. We learned from it. So now, Thriving Regions Partnership Program, we spend a lot more time up front with the local planning and leadership team to make sure not so much that they can work together, but that they feel comfortable telling us when they don't want something. Essentially, we spend a lot more time with that planning team up front. We make sure that they feel absolutely confident that they have a say throughout that process. And it actually paid off when COVID struck, because we were in the middle of two Thriving Regions processes, which we were able to transition online and actually have great projects out of it that were done completely online, including post-project engagement and planning with the community. But that was possible only because we actually had a chance to spend all the time up front. As a successful project, I really want to talk a little bit about Dr. Kelly Wadden's, what we refer to in the Harris Center. I still don't know what the official name of that project is. We refer to it as Big Water Project. Some years ago, we had a chunk of money that was left over from research fund in rural and remote communities drinking water research fund. And we knew that Newfoundland and Labrador desperately needed a baseline study. And we approached Environmental Policy Institute and Dr. Kelly Wadden and said, look, here's the chunk of money we have. What would you do with it to help us get to this? And she was excellent. She built a steering committee that was almost entirely community-based. It had all the relevant organizations, levels of government, partners. It took a little bit longer. The project probably took 18 months instead of a year, but it was excellent. What this allowed is that throughout the project, she was able to work with her partners and immediately feed the community's preliminary findings. Here are 5 things you can do right now to improve your water quality. 6 months down the road, they were able to give them 5 other things that they learned about. It also helped them develop a really close working relationship with one of the partners. So the communications officer would go through the academic presentation that was meant for the public and say, you can't say this, give me that. And they would help them build a presentation that was actually relevant to the community partners, right? So it was a really close working relationship. It continued well past that project. And in many ways, today, that is a model both for that organization in the province, how to engage with memorial researchers. They completely changed how they think about research, but also for a whole cohort of PhD students who are now faculties across this country, how to engage on large community-based projects. So that was super successful, but again, that was a very committed researcher who started it right from the beginning.
Wow. So that was really interesting. Everybody learned something through the ups and downs of all of this. And I bet through the successes, there was lots learned as well. Okay, I'm going to do a couple of quick hits before we go to Rebecca for some Q&A for the last little bit. So using your fingers, what's a typical project timeline? 1 year, 2 year, 3 year? What do you think? Like a successful 2 years? 3, 0.
Hard to tell.
Don't know. So, all right, let me reframe that question. If you say your project's going to take 18 months, how long does it normally take? 2, 3, 2. Okay, so back to that timeline again, which is when you think it should take 2 weeks, it takes 6. If it takes 18 months, or 24. Okay, who owns the data? Who owns the data? Very quickly, start with Kelly. Who owns the data?
Well, from an Indigenous perspective, Indigenous communities should own their own data, and that's a trend that's happening right now. But this is what is worked out in that relationship, right? Like this is why, and and just to reflect on what Josh was saying earlier, there are projects that are going to be super short, and that relationship is very finite and it's very specific. This is what all that relationship building is about. What are the parameters? And so data sovereignty is one of those conversations that has to happen at the very beginning, not after you've collected the data, but before you've actually created a relationship.
Yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
I might, if I can just say a couple of things.
Sure.
What Kellyanne said, but also sometimes we forget that as researchers, brokers, people who truly believe in this, there are things that are completely outside of our control. It depends on funders. It depends on internal university procedures. It depends on a whole, sometimes literally on legislation. It is really difficult. So establishing that relationship and that agreement up front is really, really important, because there is a chance that together you will have to fight the system to make it happen. But you can do that only if you agreed upfront of what that's going to look like, because there is a very good chance that some of that stuff is completely out of your hands.
Yeah, good point. Anybody else want to, Josh?
Just, we're working through this right now on one of our projects, and one thing I think to think about is what's the power relationship in those negotiations looking like? Because often the process is you're starting with a boilerplate agreement that someone at the university will send you. And those boilerplate agreements are strong in some areas and they need to be there. But how do you build on that boilerplate agreement? And I think one of the things is to kind of give all the partners permission to build on it. So some of the boilerplate and legal stuff is going to need to be there, and some of that isn't movable because of those requirements that Boyan's talking about. But then there's nothing stopping you from adding an appendix to that agreement that says, how are we actually going to work together as humans, right? Like, how are we going to respect each other, and what is our relationship going to be like? Some of the softer stuff that actually matters in terms of those protocols, I think building that into the same agreement that governs exactly, what server your data is going to live on matters, because those agreements as they stand, the written parts of them are very technical and can be really daunting, even for folks like our team. We're pretty familiar with them, and still your eyes glaze over sometimes. So just thinking about how do we humanize that process of negotiation, and find, to Boyan's point, like where are there places we might be able to push back or make changes, and where are the just things that the funders are going to say this has to be this way, or the rules are X, because some of those things are, again, for most community partners, that's not an area of knowledge anyways, and there's some amount of trust in the academic side of a relationship in laying out what those guidelines are.
Thanks, Josh.
Can I just add something? I mean, one thing we have to consider as well, though, that as researchers, we have an obligation to be publishing our research. So if within some community projects, I'm just providing a service to those community members. But if there's a graduate student involved, the graduate student actually owns copyright on their thesis work. So I'm actually careful to make sure that if it is with a community partner, that the partner has agreed that the graduate student can go that route, because you can get into a real difficult spot if a community partner says, no, you can't publish that data. And then you've got a graduate student who has that expectation for their thesis and graduation. Sometimes you can put a cap on it where the student cannot publish it for 2 or 3 years if there's sort of some sort of industrial, reason that the partner doesn't want it published. But it can be pretty tricky, and you do need to negotiate it up front.
Yeah, so that's the nuts and bolts. Some of the nuts and bolts, the rules. Anybody else with any comments on that one? Garrett, you're good? Nope, we're all right. Okay, so I think we're at the time now where we can probably kick in on some of the chat questions if we'd like to. Here's some of the themes that I just pulled out of our conversation, but it's not everything that we pulled out. So foundation is critical. The foundational work at the very beginning is critical. The themes of what you're working on really need to line up, right? So sometimes you could go to a community group wherever you're going, and what you think is right may not be right. So be open for that. Timelines don't always necessarily line up. Relationships versus transactions. I love that, Kellyanne. Everything is based around communications. Provide that safe space for feedback and for you to hear that people don't think this is going to work, and that as the researcher you need to be able to capture that respectfully and say, okay, yeah, I've just been told, and so that would be that provide that safe space for them, and then have that for yourself as well. Partnership goals. What does a partnership look like? Tangible takeaways. So Boyan, in Kelly Vodden's example that you gave, right? These tangible things that people can grab onto and actually use versus something way out in left field that the community mightn't do. It's okay to turn everything upside down. It's all right. Maybe that's what needs to be done to make it successful. Co-design. So don't go in with it half-baked or full-baked to begin with, because that's not at all reasonable. And the power relationship, make sure you look at that, and that power relationship is respectful and people are not intimidated, for example, either way. One of the things that I'd like to add to that is deficit language. A couple of years ago, and many of the organizations around the province would use at-risk, vulnerable, and we've shifted that around now. So we don't use that at risk and vulnerable. And we do something completely different. So it's more about an opportunity-based language versus a deficit. And when you approach it, when we've approached it with that, it's obviously it's opened the door a lot quicker than saying vulnerable or at risk. So those are the things that I very quickly jotted down, which I have all kinds of notes everywhere. So there is a question here from Ivan White. And he says, I know it's not easy to answer, but I'd like people to speak to the loyalty piece. If you see potential harm coming in a relationship with a community, especially in situations where there is no policy or lack of one that cares for anything but the academy, how do you deal with that situation? And thanks to Ivan for the question. So, panelists, who would like to tackle that one? And if you need to read it again, it's in the chat. So potential harm coming in a relationship with a community.
Maybe I'll take a shot at it.
Sure, thank you.
It's hard to answer because every situation would be different, right? I would hope that we have built enough of a relationship that the community partner will feel comfortable letting me know about it in the first place. Because if we don't know about it, there is nothing we can do, right? Certainly, in terms of depending of what kind of harm we are talking about, we can simply don't assume maliciousness right from the beginning. Just sit down with the researcher and have an honest chat about it, because maybe they're just teaching 3 classes that semester and have 2 new graduate students, and they didn't really mean what that came across like. And that's in the best possible way, you solve that problem because you can repair that relationship. So you need to repair the relationship. If it's a very serious harm, there are all sorts of ways and channels to deal with it. But I think we as community brokers have the obligation to protect the community, and in case that there is a student involved, to protect the student as well. One of the things that there is really not a lot we can do in terms of telling an academic what to do. I have no power to tell anybody what to do, literally. All I can do is kind of cajole, bribe, beg, and be nice to everybody and hope it works out. That honestly, this whole thing is built on being kind and on hope. Because we have no power as the brokers of relationships between the community and the researcher. So really an honest dialogue, and these situations can get very tricky and very serious. But then, building some sort of a conflict resolution right in the beginning of that process, or having a conflict resolution process as part of your organization, that's where this kind of stuff really becomes important. But this entirely depends on the situation. As a rule, you should protect community and you should protect students. Adults can take care of themselves.
Okay, Josh?
I might just add one thing to that, which is like to be aware of the early warning signs for those kind of problems. I think there's one of the ones that's most common in this type of work is that we're governing these partnerships around sort of collaborative tables, right? There's 5, 6, 10 people sitting around a table. And one of the most common early warning signs I see is someone disappears, right? Stops showing up. And I think it's always a yellow flag, right? It might be that a person's too busy, but it might also be that there's something really damaging that happened that you missed. And like, I think there's a risk that you get too attached to the collective governance of these projects, and you're scared to just give someone an email or a phone call on the side to say, hey, like, I haven't seen you in a while. What's on the go? Is everything all right? Like, there are some early interventions that I think matter in these partnerships. And I think sometimes you can get around the hierarchy or the implied hierarchy of how these projects are organized. Like if you see someone else at one of those tables, even if you're not sharing it, it's perfectly fine to go reach out and say, hey, haven't seen you in a while, you're all right. And that can, some of this is, again, that doesn't deal with the difficult situation when harm has already occurred in a significant way, but sometimes you can maybe avoid it with that kind of early intervention. And just like, it's not that much good to build that into your formal processes, because who's comfortable like coming to one of those tables and laying it all out there? Not often, right? Like that, some of that is just going to be implicit and kind of subtle. But anyways, just a thought on like how to avoid it in the first place, maybe.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Josh. All right, here's I've got a couple of questions here. One of them would be, I'd like to hear your thoughts on
Kelly,
how institution. Oh,
I think
Garrett?
Kelly wanted to respond to that last bit.
I didn't see your hand, Kelly. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. I just wanted to say that I'm one of those in-between people. I'm one of those people who's brokering relationships, but I'm also part of each of the 2 communities that I'm working with. And one of the things that happens is that people tell me absolutely everything. And like what was said, as I have no power inside the institution to go to someone and say, these are terrible, terrible things and you have to stop doing them. I can say something, and depending on my relationship with them, with those people, I can be more frank or less frank. But it's a burden for the people in between too, because I know so many things you wouldn't even believe, and I can't do anything with many of them. But I can be more, I then use that information, and anytime I give a presentation or anytime I'm invited to come talk to a unit or anything, I use all those examples without any identifying information and just give it as like, these are cautionary tales that you need to stay away from, or this happened and you don't want that to happen. But this is, in the question, Ivan talks about the lack of a policy around anything like this. And this is one of the issues that happens anytime that you have an institution engaging with communities, is that institution is steeped in policies that have been tweaked and had lawyers and all kinds of people figure out the language. And it's all about honestly protecting the institution. And it's not about protecting community. So I think that there is a trend though, and I'm looking like way far ahead. So, but the position of communities in these relationships is slowly getting closer. It's not even, but it is shifting in the sense that there's a lot more community involvement, and communities become a little bit more vocal when something isn't going the way that they had been told it was going to go, or they thought it was going to go. And so I feel like if we keep on trying to be more open and really honest and walk with cultural humility as an institution, that in 10, 15, 20 years, we may not be having the same conversations about harm that we are having right now. So anyway, that's my addition to that. Thanks.
Great addition. Thanks, Kelly. Okay, we're ready to move on to the next one. We've got about 15 minutes left, but there's two really important questions here. So got to get them both in. So one of them is, what are your thoughts on how the institution itself can help facilitate conditions for relationships? So from an institution, what can the institution do to help? Josh?
I'm quick off on this one, but they could pay people. That's a good one. To be frank, money matters. The academic folks in these relationships are usually on the clock and being paid for their work. The community people are not. There are ways around that. There are boundaries to that, of course, but I think just like figuring out ways to put dollars into these relationships really matters. You know, whether that's like compensating people for participating in the kind of steering committee, guidance committee work, whether that's compensating lived experience participants, whether that's buying out staff time at community partners. I think the more we got to kind of put our money where our mouths are sometimes, and it's gotten way better. And I'll be honest with you, like the university, I work mostly with MUN, but in general, like it's gotten better in the last few years. Like it's been easier to kind of have that real skin in the game, but there are definitely places that it could be even better and even smoother in terms of putting real resources into community work. Like if anyone's ever tried to get a university honoraria directed to an organization, I wish you well, because it's a nightmare. So like even these, like there are some little tiny process pieces within the like bureaucracy that still don't work that well. And just like thinking about all these little pieces that, but like $500 to a tiny community organization that's partnering on something can really matter, right? I'm not saying that that's the universally the answer, but I think like real resources are important.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, so if your time is worth something, so are the other people's time, right? Anybody got a real quick answer for that one before we move on? Yeah, okay.
Just maybe me, you will see it. I think Josh is right. It's getting better, mostly because we learned from inside how to use some mechanisms that exist for purposes that they were never meant for. But we are also getting a little bit better at building right up front. So Office of Public Engagement funding builds those opportunities right into the funding hall. With the Relationship Building Fund for the Arctic research, we explicitly say if you are having an event, you can use this funding to pay performers at a cultural event. You can, offer an honorarium. Does that create a massive amount of administrative headache for us? Yes, but we'll deal with that when the time comes. So we are getting better, but that's a major way we could get even better.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I think that's really good. Okay, on to the next question. How does, and this is from Brady, how does historical context of institutional relationships impact relationships in general? Urban versus rural, Western versus Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing? And how can researchers, practitioners reflect on these contexts to inform their approach to relationship building? Garrett, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, maybe. So when we talk about engaging with a variety of different types of stakeholders in the PhD program, first of all, we take a lot of our kind of the good practices around engagement, we take a lot of it from scholarship around Indigenous research and Indigenous engagement. So that's an extremely interesting and useful and valuable context to appreciate, because we find that lessons from that context apply in many other contexts. But paired with that, the other thing that we try to do, and this is something that we're going to work on and I hopefully get better at over time, is also acknowledge that those four categories are maybe not perfect, but we sort of have industry, government, NGO, Indigenous communities and organizations. But recognizing that specifically when we're talking about Indigenous research, that there are, there is a particular, I'm struggling a little bit with using the exact right words here, but let's say a particular, maybe a sensitivity or awareness or caution that should be considered in that sort of context. And doing a bit of additional work to educate our students on some of the background, some of the basic information about Indigenous peoples in the province, for example, like acknowledging that that is needed in order for students to be able to effectively engage with that context in a way that it's still helpful in every other engagement context, but there's like an obligation to understand how colonialism is shaping those relationships and how history is shaping those relationships, and not exacerbating that problem or allowing our sort of hidden biases to continue that problem. So there's a bit of additional awareness and sort of what isn't always intuitive for everybody, like awareness and understanding to think about in those contexts. So I do think that there is, there are good practices that apply across the board, but there is, to do things effectively, I do think you have to pay special attention to the context that you mentioned. So we're thinking about Indigenous sort of settler relationships in our course. We also mentioned rural-urban, and that's something we haven't thought about. So there might be some more work for us to do there, for example. And of course, lots more to do on Indigenous research as well.
Great, thanks, Garrett. Kelly, I see your hand.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really important that anyone who is attempting to engage in relationships with Indigenous communities, and just to go back to what Garrett was saying, like understanding the history of colonialism, you have to understand, then you have to educate yourself almost, academically and emotionally to understand that you need to be very deliberate in your action. If your goal is to be a lot more inclusive, and if your goal is to bring Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing into what your work is, you have to do that very deliberately. If you think about how we go through our days, and we live in a neighborhood where we know where the ruts in the road are, and we know where the curbs are, and we can just zip on by. You have to stop and get rid of that muscle memory and say, like, how am I putting each foot forward in this? How am I keeping this in the forefront of my mind as I am making even just a quick decision about something that you think is so minor? If you're in a relationship with a community, you need to have that conversation with them and not have to come back later and say, I thought it was no big deal. It is a big deal. It's a big deal. You have to be very, very deliberate. And if you aren't, if you're not ready for that, then do something else and then come back to that and engage. But being very deliberate in what you do and understanding that there are historical reasons why people might respond to certain things a certain way, or not have had access, and also getting rid of that deficit language, which I'm really glad that people are talking about, because it's so frustrating. Indigenous peoples are often lumped into this vulnerable group thing, and they're anything but vulnerable. But I mean, resilient would be a better word, and even that's not appropriate. But just be very deliberate is my, I guess, advice.
Yeah, that's great, Kelly. I know that everybody that comes to work with Smart Ice, we do the First Light cultural awareness training, and it's mind-blowing to a lot of people that have never had exposure to that before. And that's just a simple thing that we do, but it's really interesting because it really stirs up a lot of conversation between our Indigenous and non-Indigenous identifying staff. Borean, I think you might have the last word here today before Rebecca kicks in. Oh, we can't hear you.
I'm saying I didn't necessarily want that. I just do want to say one more thing, and that's really directed at researchers, is Well, all of this is true, and there is all of this historical context you need to be aware of. Do not underestimate the agency that you have as a researcher. You have enormous freedom to do things the way you want them done. Well, literally nobody can tell a researcher how to do the research. It's really entirely up to you. So use that agency for good.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to turn this over to Rebecca. Note that there is going to be a survey. So we want you to do the survey if you don't mind doing that, please, for the Harris Center. And I want to thank all the panelists. And it was really great to get to know you. And thanks again to the Harris Center for the opportunity to do this. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Carol Ann. Yeah, we're right near the end of our session. We do appreciate if you can fill out the survey. One key part there is that you can actually help shape future sessions. We really do listen to the themes that you're interested in hearing more about, and we have lots of capacity both at Memorial, within Newfoundland and Labrador, and even universities and community organizations across the country. So we're really happy to be able to shape these sessions based around what everyone really actually wants to learn about and know. Yeah, I want to say thank you again to our wonderful panel and to Carol Ann, our host. You've all just been so generous and open with your time. You've shared things that have worked. You've shared things that haven't worked, which is something that can be quite difficult to do in this kind of a setting. So we thank you. There will be a recording of the session, and we'll be doing our best to share it near and far. We tend to get really great results in terms of people taking a look after the fact as well. So thank you for helping us build that resource for the university and for the community. And thank you, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everybody. Great to see you all.